Thank you. The song after the lesson is God is Calling the Prodigal, song number 179.
Well, after tonight, we'll be halfway through the meeting. Not in terms of days, but in terms of the lessons. We'll be finished with half of the lessons. And all God's people praised him. We're going to be looking tonight at a lesson I've entitled God on the Front Porch. And I think the title of that will become clear to you when we get deeper into the lesson. I want to begin, though, in John chapter 1. I want to look at a passage that I think a lot of us have kind of looked through or passed without really stopping to think what it meant. John chapter 1, I'm looking at verse 17. It says this, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ." The law was given through Moses, and we might even add the word for emphasis, but grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. Truth came through Jesus. Now that doesn't mean that Moses never revealed any truth, but we do want to ask the question, what did Jesus reveal that Moses didn't? What did he tell us that Moses gave us no real deep indication of? And look at verse 18, because I think that's the answer. "No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." I like the way the New American Standard reads there. So here's the point. The law came through Moses, but Jesus came to give us grace and truth by showing us what God really is like. No one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God in the bosom of the Father, and that's Jesus, he has, and I love this, explained him. Now, he's not just gave us words about him, but has kind of broken down who he is and what he is. So you take that and add that to one quick passage in John 17. "This is eternal life," Jesus said, "that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." There, Jesus, again, I think, ties this idea of seeing God through whatever it is Jesus tells us. Jesus came to make known the will and the heart of God in a way Moses nor any of the Old Testament prophets could. Because, as John 1 said, the only begotten God in the bosom of the Father, who was closer to the heart of God than Jesus himself. So, I want to now run you through real quickly, before we get to our text in Luke 15, a couple of things that will set the tone for our lesson this evening. I'm in Luke chapter 5, and I'm looking at verse 30. Luke 5, verse 30. "The Pharisees and their scribes began grumbling at his disciples, saying, 'Why do you eat and drink with the tax collectors and the sinners?'" Now keep that and go to chapter 7 in Luke, chapter 7, and look at verses 36 through 47. I'm going to kind of summarize this section for you. One of the Pharisees wanted Jesus to dine with him. And there was a woman in the city who was a sinner. And when she learned he was reclining, she brought this alabaster vial. You remember this story. And she came standing behind him, weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. And she kept wiping them with the hair of her head and kissing his feet and anointing them with the perfume. And the Pharisee, when he saw this, said, if this man were a prophet, he'd know who and what sort of person this woman is who's touching him, that she's a sinner. And Jesus, I love this, Jesus answered him. Now you notice that the verse says in verse 39, the Pharisee said to himself, and yet Jesus answered him. I mean, wouldn't that be eerie? You're sitting in this building tonight, and one of you thinks something like, well, this is a really confusing lesson so far. And all of a sudden I said, I understand what you're thinking, but stay with me and it's going to make sense. You go, whoa, you better watch what I'm thinking. Jesus answered him, I have something to say to you. And he said, well, say it. And he talked about two debtors, one who owed a great amount of money and one who owed a little amount of money, and neither one was able to repay, and he forgave both of them. Which one will love him more? And Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said, you've judged correctly. And he said, then he goes on to talk about the difference in the woman and her relationship with him and Simon and his relationship with Jesus. Now, that's two cases where Pharisees said Jesus isn't doing the right thing by coddling and spending time with these blatant sinners. Now go to chapter 15, Luke chapter 15, and look at the beginning of this. Now all the tax collectors and the sinners, the very people that we were talking about before, the tax collectors and sinners were coming near him to listen to him. But the Pharisees and the scribes began to what? Grumble. Well, that's no surprise. That's what they do all the time. These guys were weaned on pickles. I mean, they got really sad, sorry attitudes and faces. And why are they grumbling? This man receives sinners and eats with them. And then you get this. Don't miss this point. Jesus is not telling this parable to tax collectors and sinners. They are coming near to listen to him. But verse 3 says, he told them this parable. Who? The Pharisees. He's talking to the Pharisees. Why? Because they don't understand the heart of God. The Pharisees think they know God. Their name and their whole attitude was one of separation. Why does Jesus spend time with publicans and sinners? These separatists say, you ought to separate from them. You don't need to be around them. They aren't worth your time. The problem was the Pharisees didn't know God. And they didn't know whom he welcomed or rejected. They simply missed the whole point. So he tells them three parables. Luke shares three things that are lost. A lost coin, a lost sheep, a lost coin, a lost boy. All of them are outwardly insignificant. It's one sheep among many, 100. It's one coin lost due to negligence. And one boy lost due to willful rebellion. So if we were looking on in that case, we'd say, one lost sheep, he's got 99, live with what you got. If it's one coin, we'd say about the woman, you deserve to lose it, you didn't take care of it. And if we look at the boy, we probably would say, well, he got what he deserved. He shouldn't have left home. He's a rebellious boy. He went off on his own, did his own thing. Sorry, but that's life. And it just dealt him a bad hand. Jesus purposely takes three things that would be relatively insignificant and shows where the heart of God is regarding those three things. So let's begin by looking first at this young boy's lot. He's on a path of self-destruction. Spiritually, verse 13, he squandered his estate with loose living. Physically, he's self-destructing. Verse 14, he began to be impoverished. Financially, he is bankrupt. Socially, he's on a path of self-destruction. No one was giving anything to him in verse 16. And emotionally, he is bankrupt. Verse 19, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. I'm just not worthy. Unworthy even to return as a son or a household slave. You know, there's even a difference in Israel's economy between a household slave and a hired man. The difference is somebody who works for you regularly. That's the household slave. But the hired hand is just a contract worker. He works only at the behest of the owner and only as long as the owner is willing to pay him. He doesn't even have vesture in the owner's property or finances. He says, I'm not worthy to be your son. I'm not worthy to be a household slave. Make me just one of the hired guys. One of the guys who comes by and asks, you got work? Can I work for a day or a couple of days? Make me like one of them. And I want you to know, it says in verse 20, he got up and came where? You know, he's been talking about being away from home and being away from the benefits of home. But when he came back, what does it say he came back to? His father. He got up and came to his father. He doesn't come to the farm. He doesn't come to his friends. He doesn't come to his family. I'm not saying those things aren't there. But what really matters to him is his father. And I want to say something to you, because I've made this mistake. I have sometimes talked to people who've left the Lord, and I have said to them, you need to come back to church. Now, I'm not saying church isn't important. It's vital. It is where we encounter God and his people. It's where we see the spirit and heart of Christ played out. It's vital. It's not just a good thing, it's a vital thing. But when we're inviting people to come back because they've left, what they have left that's most important is the Lord. And we need to be careful to invite them back to God. Now, in doing that, they'll come back to the church. But God is the most important thing they've left if they've done what this boy has done. I will get up and go to my father. So he got up and came to his father. It's important for us to remember that. So this is what Jesus is revealing. This is what he's talking about. This idea of this boy returning to God, and that this is the God he returns to. So, look at verse 20. So he got up and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him. Now, I want you to think about that. We live in an era where it's difficult, if you have certain devices, for anybody to come close to your house without being identified. We've got a Ring doorbell. And so even when we're away from home, if somebody comes up on the porch, we know they're there. Our phones will signal they're there. Some people have surveillance cameras. I walk in my neighborhood and some of the people have signs. They say, "Smile, you're on camera." Some of the houses, when I walk and it's just before sun up, I walk past their houses and they have lights that come on. Security lights, because motion has been detected and it lightens up their yards. This boy is a long way off and the father knows he's coming. I want you to think about that for a few minutes. I'm going to make some surmising, but I think it's warranted. The father doesn't hear his dogs taking off after him, howling to go down there and find whoever it is that's encroaching on his property. I don't think the father was busy doing some other things and just happened to look up, and that was the one time he looked up and saw the boy. It says he saw him while he was still far off. The father saw him while he was still far off. You know what that says? That father spent a lot of time on the front porch. We have grandsons who attend school right catty corner from our house. It's right across the street. And every afternoon, our daughter or our son-in-law drives a car up into our driveway to pick up the boys. They come across the street and get in the car and they go home. My wife loves seeing the boys at the end of the day. She doesn't just take a chance that she might happen to catch them. In order for her to know she'll see the boys, you know what she has to do? Sit on the front porch. So she goes out there and she sits in a rocking chair and she waits for the boys to come. When they cross the street, she sees them coming from a distance. Why? She's watching for them. I don't believe this father just happened to walk by a window and go, "Who's that coming?" "Well, that's my son." I think this father has a heart Jesus is revealing. He is sitting on the front porch. He is waiting in expectation. How long? Nobody's told him, "Your boy, I just heard about him. He's kind of reached rock bottom and I think he's on his way home." This is a father who is looking for him in expectation daily. He's wanting him to come home. He's expecting him to come home. And then continue the story with me. His father saw him, and the very first thing, felt compassion for him. This is not the same boy who left his home. He's a shell of himself. His clothes are hanging off his body. Listen, he's suffered a famine. He's eaten so little in the past weeks, maybe months, that he's willing to eat pig slop, swill. Now you gotta remember, he's a Jewish boy. Jewish boys don't mess with pigs. They don't raise them. They've never eaten bacon. They've never had a ham. They don't go to the honey-baked ham store and look around. He's a Jewish boy. Ham, bacon, fatback are forbidden him. This boy has violated every custom of his people. Why? Because he's desperate. How desperate? He will willingly eat the slop, those pigs are dipping their snouts in. One time at Florida College, in a challenge that I offered to some students, the result was whoever lost that particular challenge would have to kiss a goat on stage. Goats are no fun to kiss. I know. But I'll have to tell you, that competition, that challenge would have never existed if somebody had said, let's get a pig. That's a nasty animal. Here is a boy who's coming home so emaciated, without food for so long, that he has actually considered eating pig swill. He is broken. Now, I'll tell you one more thing that really touches my heart, is that from a distance, the father still knew him. I don't imagine this boy looked anything like the boy who left home. Do you think? I mean, his hair is probably long and scraggly, whereas before, when he left, he was well taken care of. His clothes were clean and white, and now they're stained and tattered. He's barefooted, doesn't even have sandals anymore. This is not in any way the boy who left home, but the father knows him. I am so thankful that God sees past my sins and my scars and my failures and recognizes me as his son. God on the front porch saw him. He felt compassion for him, not judgment. Wouldn't it have been easy for the father? His heart has been torn. Can you see him maybe folding his hands across his chest and saying, well, 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 here he comes. Mr. Successful. Well, how's that been? To quote Dr. Phil, how's that working for you, boy? It would be easy for him to have a grim satisfaction. Well, I see it's time you started listening to me again. It doesn't say that at all. He felt compassion for him. And then it says two words, and ran. I think of all the things that I'm going to share with you from this verse, the one that touches me most are those two words. See, you have to understand what it would have been like for a man in the Jewish culture to run, because they wore floor-length robes. You can't run in a robe. You just think in terms of running in a full-length terry cloth robe. You just can't do that. And they didn't do that. Whenever they had to exert themselves in any kind of running competition or many of the works they did, Jewish men would do something that we find an unusual phrase. They would gird up their loins. Now, what that meant was, picture a man in a floor-length skirt, because that's what a robe would have looked like. In order for them to free their legs up so they could run and not be flapping against the front of that linen robe the whole time, a man would reach down and grab the back part of that robe, not the front, the back part. And he would bring it up in front between his legs and tuck it into his belt, thus creating kind of rough, like pantaloons. I mean, almost like parachute pants is what it would look like, but much rougher and much more difficult to maneuver in. But that's the only way, that or else grabbing it up and pulling it up and running like my grandmother did on one occasion when I was hurt and she ran out in the yard. My grandmother always wore long dresses, and she just kind of hiked it up and went running after me. It's the only way that man can do that. Now, you also need to think in terms of who he is. He's not a young man. He's got 2 grown boys. He may be an old man. I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this or experienced anything of this kind, but it is one thing to see a young man go running past you. A young man, they run. Boys run. Young men run. Old men don't run unless there's some major emergency or problem. I've often said, I love to walk. That's why I got my last name. But I don't run unless something's chasing me. To see an old man running down a path with his loins girded up, running toward that boy, is both one of the most embarrassing sights and one of the most touching sights imaginable. He is not waiting for the boy to come to him. He is running to meet his son. Great desire. He cannot wait to see his boy. He's exposed his legs, running down that road toward that gaunt, emaciated, defeated figure of his son. It's an undignified sight. But his thinking is, who cares? God cares. This is the heart of God that Jesus is revealing to him. This is the heart of God Jesus wants us to see. Not the grim, judgmental, satisfied, always right God, but the God who is on the front porch running to meet the boy he has waited to come home. It says 2 more things. It says he embraced him. This boy stinks. Literally. He's been feeding pigs. He hasn't gotten a shower, gotten cleaned up, gotten on some chariot or bus and come home. He has the dirt of the road on his body. He has the odor of sweat under his arms and on what little clothing he still has left. He stinks like a pig pen. And the father embraces him. Doesn't hold him at arm's length. He embraces him. And then this word, and kissed him. Now the word kissed him here is actually not as accurate as I want to make it for you. There are some words that are a punctiliar word. It means they did it. But there's another word that means they did it again and again and again. When our family would go visit my father's parents in Fort Meade, Florida, we would drive up the driveway to the house. And they lived on a gravel driveway. As we drove up to the house, my sister and I began to dread the ritual that was going to take place. My grandmother would come out a screen door and it would slam, and she always was washing her hands, wiping her hands off on a towel because she had been in the kitchen cooking or cleaning. And my grandma would stand at the top of rickety back porch stairs, and she'd be wiping her hands and waiting for us. And my mother would always say, "Get out, go say hello to your grandma." And we hated it for this reason. My grandma would hold her arms out, and we would run to her, and she would not just kiss us once. She would grab my head, and it was all over my head. Wet, sloppy, slobbery kisses that I wish I could feel today. This word, "and kissed him," is really the word, he continued to kiss him. He's planting loving, gracious, welcome home kisses all over the dirty, grimy, smelly, sweaty face of this boy. Percy Walker, in his book Love in the Ruins, said, "We love those who know the worst of us and don't turn their faces away." Listen to that again. We love those who know the worst of us and don't turn their faces away. Instead of the message, "No undesirables allowed here," Jesus is proclaiming, in this parable, in God's kingdom, there are no undesirables. Come home. Now, I want you to notice something else. You remember the boy said, "I'm going to go to my father, and I will say to my father, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men.'" Do you know he's not spoken a word yet? He's not said a thing. This father isn't going to him because the boy has said, "Daddy, I repent. I'm wrong. I sinned. I'm sorry." He hasn't heard one word from that boy's lips, but he is embracing and repeatedly kissing him. And I want you to notice in verse 21, the boy never gets to finish his speech. I mean, it's not a long speech, but he had rehearsed it. In verse 21, he says, "I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." What followed? "Make me as one of your hired men." He never got to say that, because the father didn't want to hear that. It says, "But the father said to his slaves," I'm going to tell you, this is the most compassionate act on his part. He said to the slaves, now notice, the slaves have run behind the father. They're out there with them, away from the house. Who's in the house? The household slaves, his brother, perhaps other family members that are there. The only ones that see him out here, away from the house, are the father and his slaves. And he says, "Bring out the best robe. Put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet." Why is he doing that? The father doesn't want anybody to see his son in this condition. He's going to clothe him. He's going to make him his with that ring. He's going to put sandals on his feet. He wants to make his boy like the boy who left home. Only the Father saw him in his shameful, sin-filled state. And only our Father sees our true depravity and loves us in spite of that. What a scene. What a revelation of the heart of God. I want to close this lesson with a story and then a short admonition, and then we're going to sing our invitation song. You're going to think you recognize this story and it's a fable or just a song you might have heard, and not realize that it actually is rooted in fact in my home state of Florida. G.W. Rosenberry was a denominational preacher who was traveling across the state of Florida on a train. There was a boy who was on that train, and Rosenberry says he noticed that the boy was very agitated, very nervous, constantly wringing his hands, looking out the window, pumping his knees, and just agitated and moving, fidgeting nervously. So Rosenberry, the preacher, sat next to him and said, "Son, what's wrong? Tell me what's wrong." And the boy told him this story. He said, "I had a fight with my father. I left home declaring I would never return home as long as my father was alive. I did not want to ever see his face again. But a couple of years later, he regretted what he said. So he wrote a letter home to his mother. He said, I'd like to come home, but I don't know if I'm welcome. If you talk to Dad and he will allow me to come home, I'm going to be riding on a train that will go by our property. And if it's okay for me to come home, would you hang a white handkerchief on the tree at the edge of our lot? If I see a white handkerchief, I'll pull the cord on the train and I'll come home. But if I don't, I'll just keep going. I'm sorry for what I said." He said, "Mister, we're coming close to my property and I don't know what the answer will be. I can't look." He asked G.W. Rosenberry, would he look out the window of the train when they rounded the corner and the property that belonged to his parents was in sight? Would he tell him if there's a white handkerchief on the corner post of their property? And here's what Rosenberry said. He said, as that train rounded the curve, he yelled to the boy, "Look, boy, look." He said that family must have taken every white piece of cloth they owned, and they had hung it on the fences and the trees and the porch. And Rosenberry said that boy pulled the cord, and the last thing he remembers seeing was that boy running across the field, his heels kicking up, and a whole family spilling off the porch to welcome him home. That is the heart of our God. There are white sheets out on the hills of eternity. While he was yet far off, the Father saw him and ran. Some of you ought to come home. You've been away a long time. The Father is on the front porch. Let's stand and sing this song.